Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the warm welcome that many of you have shown me this morning. Can I just start with just a really short prayer? Lord, please be with us here today when we hear the words about Tearfund, and let nothing hinder our hearing and our understanding this morning. Amen. Amen. So last year was Tearfund's 50th birthday. So some of you I know have known about Tearfund for a long time, maybe even 50 years. But first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to this church and to those of you who individually already support Tearfund. Thank you so much. It means so much to Tearfund to have churches like yours helping us. It's wonderful, so thank you very much. I'd like to just start by doing a Bible reading, which I'll be referring to in my talk. It's actually from Mark. And it's Mark chapter 6, which is the feeding of the 5,000, starting at verse 30. So Jesus feeds the 5,000. See, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. He said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns, and they got there ahead of them. And when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said. "It's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Well, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. Are we to go and spend all that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the grass. So they all sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and he also divided the 2 fish amongst them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish, and the number of men who had eaten was 5,000. So we'll talk a little bit about that passage in a minute. So I said it's Tearfund's 50th birthday last year. So come back to 1968 with me. I don't know if you can remember that time. I can.
No.
I can just about remember that time.
It isn't that he's not old enough, it's his memory.
Fair enough. So if you remember then, televisions had just sort of come about, and they were quite small, often black and white, and definitely very thick at the back. And it was actually a huge shock to the Christian public the first time they saw starving children in Africa on the TV. And that was in 1968 with the Biafra crisis in Nigeria from the Civil War. And Christians were outraged and very upset, and they sent cheques and letters and monies to the offices of the Evangelical Alliance and asked them to send the money and the help to their church contacts in Nigeria. And that's when the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund became Tearfund that we know today. And that airlift that resulted from that generosity actually saved 1 million lives. So last financial year, Tearfund provided emergency help to people in crisis, over 1 million people. And its long-term development work was carried out with nearly 4 million people. And Generous people like you gave £75 million to Tearfund last year to use for its work. So that sounds like a lot of money, but is it just a drop in the ocean? Because we still see on TV starving children sometimes in Africa, Yemen and in Syria. But actually, the number of people living in absolute poverty, which is the worst type of poverty, has fallen dramatically. The World Bank estimates in 1980 that 44% of the world's population was living on less than $2 a day. So fast forward to 2015, it's become 10% of the world's population. And given that the population has increased tremendously in that time, that's quite an amazing thing. So Tearfund's vision is to see the end of absolute poverty in our lifetimes. Now that sounds like a really big order, but I'll talk to you a little bit about how we plan to do that. We believe that it's part of God's plan for humankind, as told in the Bible, in the vision of the shared kingdom written by John, and that's in Revelations. So we don't think it's a daydream, we think it is really meant to happen, that we will see the end of poverty in our lifetime, certainly extreme poverty. So, how can we be part of that? That is the question. So, on your seats, I've left a little card. So if you can open it, see if you can find a picture of a lady. This lady here, and her name is Ruth. And I want to talk to you and tell you a little bit about Ruth. Ruth lives in rural Nigeria, in Africa, and she's one of those 10% of people who are still living in extreme poverty. She's married and has 5 surviving children, 2 of whom live at home with her and her husband. And her community is very poor. It's in a remote area. There's no running water, there's no sanitation, there's pond water. And there's been quite a lot of changes in weather patterns, which has resulted in droughts and difficulties getting water. So harvests have been poor in recent years. And basically this means that for part of the year, about 3 months of the year, Ruth and her family experience a hunger gap. They just don't have enough food to eat. And during that time, it's a real struggle for her and her family because they don't have enough food, they don't have food to sell, so they don't have any money, which means in Africa you often have to pay for schooling, so their children can't go to school because they can't pay for the schooling, and they can't pay for any medical help that they might need. So there is like desperate need for help in areas and villages like this in Nigeria. I don't think any of us can imagine a day when there was nothing to eat for breakfast, nothing to eat for lunch, and maybe nothing even to eat for dinner. You can't imagine your children being sent home from school because you hadn't been able to pay. And you can't imagine what you would do if your child was ill and you didn't have any money for medical fees. It's very hard to imagine this type of situation. But that's actually the harsh reality for nearly a billion people in the world at the moment who are living on less than $2 a day. So 1 billion people, that's an awful lot. I don't know how you feel about that, and I wonder how God feels about that. So in Nigeria, Tearfund is working in Ruth's community by partnering with a local organisation and the Church of Christ in Nigeria with one of its church and community development programmes. And it started not long ago in Ruth's village. Basically, it starts with the church, encouraging people to come to church, to reading Bible passages and learning about God's will for the world, but also learning how they can perhaps help themselves. And then people join community development programs, they can join microfinance groups, self-help groups as well. And basically, through a period of time, lives become transformed with this combination of church and practical action, like small loans to help buy fertiliser or equipment, or perhaps even a metal roof for homes. And also, just by sharing their lives together, the communities develop. So in Ruth's case, she's learnt to diversify crops so that she's not just relying on one crop, so she can have different crops at different times of the year. She managed to get a small loan for fertiliser, so the amount of maize that she produces has increased dramatically. And basically, partly through her own efforts and through the support of these groups, she started to transform her life. So there's more food now for the children. She is getting a metal roof on her home, and she has money to send the children to school. So, what can we learn from this? I mean, it's the 21st century and there are still people living in chronic poverty across the world. And, you know, the story that I read from the Bible about the feeding of the 5,000 is interesting because there are some parallels with some of the work that Tearfund is doing now. It talks about a spiritual hunger. The people were following Jesus and hearing his teachings, but there was also material hunger in that day too. People were hungry for healing, and on that day they were also hungry for food. And actually it's the same today if you look across society. People are hunting very often for meaning in their lives, and they're looking for peace and they're looking for significance in their everyday lives. And many of them are turning to faith. But also across the world, especially the billion people living in extreme poverty, they have a really strong material hunger for a better life. So what's our responsibility to those in need, and how can we best help meet that need? Two really important questions. So let's go back to the reading about the 5,000. In verse 34 it says, "When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things." So Jesus healed the sick, and he was also concerned that they were hungry for food. So he's not just interested in those people's spiritual side, but also their physical needs. And that's true of us today as well. He cares for both those things in our lives. It's interesting that the disciples seemed a little bit more limited in their compassion, because if you look in verses 35 to 36, it says, "By this time it was late in the day, and so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place. It's already late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." So their inclination was to try and close things up and perhaps head home, and they perhaps didn't want to be inconvenienced anymore. And I know sometimes we all feel like that. Some days we feel our compassion has run out and we just want to go home and put the telly on and relax for the evening. But Jesus sometimes challenges us, doesn't he, to respond. Situations pop up when you're not expecting them, and we are challenged to respond. So in verse 37, Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." So we have a responsibility to those people in need, not just in our local communities, but across the world as well. And we can't just turn a blind eye to them. And we can't just limit the scope of the gospel to our immediate surrounds. It's far-reaching. Jesus challenges us to consider always how we can care for those in need. If you look across Scripture, there is a bias in lots of Jesus' teachings to the poor, to widows, to orphans, immigrants, those struggling. So how do we help people in need? It's a deep question, and I think this story does give us some insights. Because when Jesus said, well, we need to find a way to feed these people, the disciples were in disbelief. Whoa, that's like 8 months of a year's salary. And maybe when we look at the prospect of helping 1 billion people across the world, maybe we feel, that's a massive task. But just think about Nigeria for a moment. Nigeria actually does have some immense natural resources. And there are some people in Nigeria who are extremely wealthy. But there are food shortages in many parts of the country. In the last 7 years, 20,000 people have been killed by Boko Haram, a militant group in the north of the country. And that's resulted in 1.7 million people being displaced from their homes, who have to live in other areas now. Population of Nigeria, I don't know if anyone knows the population of Nigeria. Any thoughts?
60 million.
That's actually 180 million. It's huge.
Close.
Yeah, massive. I was really surprised when I first learned that figure, 180 million. And it's estimated that half of those people, that's 90 million people, are living in extreme poverty. And that actually makes Nigeria the country, I think, with the largest number of people living in extreme poverty in the world. And by extreme poverty, we mean the worst sort, when people are really just living from day to day, trying to scratch a living off the land, and some days can't manage to do that. So, the disciples were wondering how they could feed all these peoples, and we're wondering how we can, solve some of these big problems in the world, like in Nigeria. So, Jesus saw the situation differently. He said, well, how much bread do you have? What have you got now in your hands? Well, that's okay. That will be enough. We're going to use what we have. And then a miracle happened, an amazing thing happened. And with God, often less is more. So Jesus didn't focus on what they didn't have. He thought about what they did have. And he gave thanks for what they did have. And actually, that's the way Tearfund works in many countries. Looking at to see what local communities already have. So what do they have? What land do they have? What ideas do the people have there? What chances are there? What crops do grow in that area? Is there a church? So what we're trying to do is look at the resources that already exist and work with people. So for Ruth, that meant, as I said, new plants, diversification, fertiliser, different farming techniques. And she learnt all those through the self-help groups that she discovered at the church. And less became so much more for Ruth. But it also restored her personal dignity. Her dignity that she was then able to feed her family and meet family needs. So God can take what we give and it can multiply our gifts in many ways to improve things in these communities. So Tearfund is looking at these new ways of addressing poverty, and I think a long time ago people used to just send money to countries like Africa and then wonder why there was still poverty. But it takes so much more than that. That you need to spend time and effort working with local communities to make things happen. And it's important that we try and empower the people who are living there so that even maybe in the future when things have moved on, that they feel empowered, that they feel they can make some contribution to their community and change their fate themselves, and through that gain greater self-esteem. So looking at sustainable solutions to poverty and free from ongoing dependence back on funds coming in forever. So we want to help communities lift themselves out of poverty through these church and community transformation programs. And actually since 2001, we've been working in 41 countries with 10 million people. And we really want to scale this up in the next 10 years. So I think the message that we hear from this parable is, not parable, there's this chapter in Mark, is not to be overwhelmed by the need in the world, and that the Lord has something in mind for these communities, and through his church we can make transformation. So I'm just wondering if you can have another look at the cards that I've put on your seats. So yes, it's just a piece of paper, but it has potential to be a lot more than that. So there's a small section here on the right where you could put your personal details, and then on here on the left where you could put your bank details and sign it. So for £12 a month, you could help 2 people, like Ruth and her husband, to take part in a self-help group. For £6 a month, you could help 1 person do that. So if you feel able to contribute, please fill in the form. If you need more time to think about it, or you don't have your bank details, or you want to talk about it with your partner, just put your name and phone number, and a lovely person from Tearfund will give you a call at your convenience, just to talk things through with you. You can be completely in control over how much communication you receive from Tearfund. If you're interested in, once you become a member, that you're interested in learning more about our work, you can receive, I receive a monthly prayer diary that has a prayer for each day of the month for their work, which I really find useful in my prayers. So the little amounts that is in our hands sometimes can go an awful long way and really transform communities. So I would encourage you to pray on this, and if you feel you can give something, no matter how small, it would be wonderful for Tearfund. So Ruth prays in this way. She says, I pray that God will protect and guide me, and that there will be total transformation in my family. Can we all together pray for Ruth? Let us pray. Loving and faithful Father, we praise you for your love and mercy. Thank you for listening to us, for taking an interest in every area of our lives. Thank you that you understand our needs and that you provide us ways to help us and to help others in need. We lift up Ruth and her family to you and those in similar situations to hers, and pray with expectant faith for her prayers to be answered, and that she will feel God's guidance and protection, and that she will experience total transformation. We place our gifts and lives in your hands and ask you to use us for your glory. Amen.